This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, welcome to our fourth webinar, fourth in the series for our referendum webinar series. This webinar is Get Out the Yes Vote. These webinars have been sponsored by Springstead Incorporated and Guy K-12. My name is Julie Fitzgerald. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing for Guy K-12. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest and keynote speaker for this webinar, Dr. Don Lifto. Dr. Lifto has been a superintendent for over 25 years, has been working with Springstead Incorporated for many years, helping school districts across the country with their financial planning and making sure that referendums pass. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lifto.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be back for the fourth in the series, talking about strategies related to getting out the vote. And before we get into some of the research and best practices, I think it's a good idea, particularly since we are dealing with people using this seminar series from various states across the United States, to talk a little bit about the importance of being aware of laws, policies related to your particular state. It's important when you are planning your GOTV efforts to seek legal counsel to understand what can be done by the school district, what restrictions there are, if any, for school board members or school administrators, use of public funds, and a variety of other related legal issues to make sure that your GOTV plan meets that litmus test that is specific to your state. I could give you just one example of that, where different states have different laws, and that relates to use of robocalls for getting out the vote. A robocall is the type of call that you get when you pick up the phone and immediately hear a recorded message from someone. In some states, that can be used for reminding people to get out the vote. In some cases, it clearly can't be used. And in others, it can be used if you meet specific criteria related to how that is delivered. So that is an example of just one potential GOTV strategy where you would want to get some direction from legal counsel before moving forward. So how important is GOTV? Since I'm doing this from Minnesota, and that's where my background is, Paul Wellstone was a senator here, and he was particularly well known for very effective grassroots politics. And if you wanted to work on Senator Wellstone's campaign, you had to make three commitments. You had to volunteer 1 day a week, you had to write a check to the campaign, and you had to take election day off from work to help with GOTV work. In his last campaign, he had 5,000 people in the metro area pounding on doors from 8 in the morning until probably 7 p.m., working the last stage of that particular GOTV project. GOTV is one of three campaign functions, the other two being canvassing and communications, that are fundamentally important, and it's very, very difficult to win without doing a very good job in those areas. And unfortunately, partly because GOTV comes at the end of the campaign when people are tired, and partly because it's not easy, and oftentimes is not done particularly well. This particular chart talks about some of the challenges associated with GOTV, and this particular chart focuses on age of the voter. And so what you're seeing from left to right, if you look at the bottom of the screen, the first two bars are registered voters who are 18 to 44. In the middle voters who are 45 to 64 and 65 and up over on the right. In the dark green bars, you're seeing in this particular school election, the percentage of people who did not vote in that age group. So as you can see in the 18 to 44-year-old group, for example, almost 71% did not cast a ballot. Ironically, if you've already gone through the seminar series where I talked about scientific random sample surveys, in almost all cases, your strongest support for your referendum, whether you're asking for operating money, technology, or permission to issue debt and sell bonds, is from the 18 to 44-year-old group. So we have this disconnect between a group that typically is very, very supportive of whatever you want to do and a group that has a very, very difficult time getting in the door and casting a ballot. This chart looks at GOTV in terms of parents and non-parents. And again, the data that is being depicted on this bar chart is real data from a real school district. And as you look at the results on this particular chart, you probably can figure out that they didn't win. And so over on the left-hand side of the chart, you have parents, and 27.4% of parents who were registered voters got in the door and cast a ballot, almost equal to the percentage of non-parents at 26.3%. And this, in combination with the prior chart with poor turnout based on age, is definitely the formula for a disappointing day after the ballots are counted. This looks at a little bit different approach related to GOTV, and that is the power of contact. So when we talk about contact, what we're talking about is, did somebody call me? Did somebody knock on my door? Did somebody sit down with me at a booth at the Education Foundation or at the football game and talk to me about the importance of this particular election? And so we're either having contact or we're having no contact. The dark blue relates to whether you voted or not. The green, you did not vote. So in column 1, over on the left, 2/3 of the people who were not contacted by anybody did not vote. In column 2, 61% of the people who were contacted and indicated support for the referendum did vote. So look at that difference from 34% voting up to about 61% voting based on having contact. If you look over in column 5, this is the group of people that the campaign committee assumed were yes votes. We don't have to go over to John and Jane's house. We know they're going to vote yes. And what you're seeing here is that 60% of that group did not vote because they were not contacted. And so some of the strategies I'll be talking about as we go through here, both from research and from best practice, are going to continue to reinforce the importance of contact. So executing successful get out the vote. What options do we have? Well, this cartoon and the next you'll see in a moment, one option maybe is to cheat. So in the first part of the cartoon, we're having contact, but the contact is someone telling someone to vote on November 4 when the election is actually November 5. I don't know of any school districts that have actually used this approach. I don't know if it really would work or not. Probably not. Or you could recruit a bunch of dogs to run around the polling place with I voted stickers on. Another way that you might want to bend the rules a little bit, contrary to what I said at the beginning of the presentation. But if you're not going to cheat or have dogs helping you, what can you do that's realistic, research-based, and has the potential to be successful. So key components of a good GOTV plan. Number one is figure out how many folks are going to actually vote. Secondly, figure out how many yes votes you need to win based on the turnout estimate. In some states, that is a supermajority to win. In most states, it's 50% plus one. Third step is to canvass. Canvass is referring to being on the phone or door knocking. We're talking to registered voters, and we're trying to find out who supports the proposal and trying to find enough yes voters to win. We typically recommend that you set a target at 130% of the votes you need to win. So if you think you need 5,000 yes votes to win the election, multiply that times 1.3, and that's your target for your canvassing group. And that 30% is just margin for things that might go wrong, for people who don't vote, even though they say they will, to give you a little bit of a margin to hopefully still be successful. Plan and execute GOTV strategies that work, mobilizing yes voters identified by canvassing to maximize the turnout, and demobilize likely no voters into non-voters, cognitive dissonance. An example of cognitive dissonance might be, you might find from a feasibility survey that you have relatively low support from men who are over 65 years old, for example. So in this last part of the approach that's talking about cognitive dissonance, we ask ourselves, what could we do to give that demographic group a reason to pause and think and maybe not vote no? One example could be developing a program where older men and grandfathers come into the elementary schools every Wednesday for 45 minutes to read to kids. Now that isn't necessarily going to turn a no vote into a yes vote, but it might give some of those individuals a reason to pause. Those kids are so cute. I enjoy working with them. The teachers are great. And as I have a more positive experience with the public schools, maybe that turns me into a yes voter, or maybe it just makes me sit home and scratch my head and not vote at all, which sometimes helps the outcome of a referendum as well. So let's go through those steps in more specificity. We talked about estimating turnout. Typically, your largest turnout election is a presidential general election. Usually, the U.S. Turnout in 16 was just under 60%. Depending on the state you're in, it could be in that 60 to 75% range. That's sometimes referred to as a robust ballot election, the largest turnout election that most districts will experience. Then we have the even year non-presidential elections, and typically we see something in the 50 to 65% range in terms of turnout. And then we have what are called diminished ballot elections. This might be an election in April or August or September where the school district's referendum is the only thing on the ballot, or if there's something else on the ballot, it's very minor and will probably not affect turnout too much. So part of the basic foundation of estimating turnout and setting your yes vote target is to know what kind of election you're going into and look to see what kind of turnout has typically been the case. The URL at the bottom of this slide will give you state-by-state percentages for how your particular state does in terms of turnout, particularly in the presidential and even year, the top two. At 25 to 40% at the bottom is pretty typical across this country. in terms of those diminished ballot election turnouts. So turnout and estimating turnout is a combination of science plus the art. We talked a little bit about the science, looking back at past elections to see what kind of turnout we have experienced. Then you need to get it down and look at your local situation. This is a school district in Minnesota that for between 95 and 2011 had multiple requests in the form of a referendum for additional operating money. And notice as you look at these numbers that the district won a referendum with only 1,569 yes votes, but they lost a referendum with 2,196 yes votes, 627 more in the losing election than what it took for them to win with the 1569. And this just emphasizes the point that you have to take a look at the election context and do a good job of estimating turnout, because it will take a very, very different number of yes voters to win depending on when the election takes place. The art relates to considering the unique nature of a particular election and the context within which it will be executed. Are there other ballot proposals? I worked with a city recently that wanted to build a sports dome, and at the same time it was preparing for that referendum. The school district that it was located within was running both an operating referendum and a debt issuance referendum. So they had three tax proposals in front of the voters at the same time on the same ballot. What's the general tone of parents and the electorate? I did 2 surveys recently for school districts testing the feasibility of a referendum, and in both cases, people were asked to grade how well the district was doing in keeping people informed. In one of the districts, about 80% gave the district an A or a B in keeping them informed. In the other district, 60% gave them a D or an F in keeping people informed. Those 2 examples are very different contexts within which that referendum would be held. And if you're the district that's got 60% giving you a D or F, that might suggest that unless you're on a deadline that cannot be changed, maybe you take time out and work on some of those qualitative things for a year or 2 before going to the public. What's the chance of organized opposition based on your proposal and based on history? Organized opposition raises the turnout and makes the whole election environment much more toxic. We kind of laugh internally with this particular one. This is a real vote no sign in a real school district. We just weren't sure if they were against Blue Jeans or the school district's referendum proposal. So this chart, again, emphasizes the importance of looking at your election context before you set your target for yes voters. In all cases, we're looking at 20,000 registered voters in the district. And then from left to right, we're looking at a low turnout, a mid turnout, and a high turnout. And as you can see, kind of in the middle, horizontally, how many yes votes do we need to win? Ranges from 3251 up to 6751. So this is the planning related to looking at the type of election that you're running, the history within your district, looking at any local situations that might affect turnout, like this dome example I talked about, thinking about how likely organized opposition is, and eventually coming up with your target. In the first webinar in this series of 4, I talked about voter files and target structures. And I'll just touch on that briefly again because it's relevant to the Get Out the Vote effort. In any good election, in the middle of this particular graphic, you're going to be obtaining the file of registered voters living within the district. And we use a commercial source called L2 that includes other demographic information such as whether the person is a homeowner or a renter, how long they've lived in the community, and age. We also get voter history in terms of how frequently people vote. And then around the outside are other databases that some school districts are able to provide. And the arrows going into the center means that we're merging multiple databases into one master databases. We also increasingly are using other demographic and predictive databases. Those include Mosaic, Prism, Haystack DNA. The one we use probably the most is called VAN. And all of those databases provide additional information about voters and help us develop a voter target structure, which I'll go through in more detail in just a moment. So the typical universe of GOTV, and this relates to who are we looking for? Well, identified supporters based on a survey and canvassing. I mentioned I completed 2 feasibility surveys recently for school districts. And in that survey, we can see what demographic groups are most supportive of the referendum, male or female, young people or older people, people who live in the south part of the district or the north, renters or homeowners. So we look at multiple databases to find out where our support lies. In most school districts, high Democratic performance precincts are going to be more supportive of school referendum of any kind. For progressive voters based on VAN or other predictive databases, with the VAN database in particular, each registered voter has a numerical score based on how likely they are to vote for a progressive ballot proposal. And certainly at school districts, requests for operating technology or debt issuance in the form of a referendum would qualify as progressive in most cases. Past supporter list relates to districts like the one I showed you a moment ago that had multiple elections over time. Well, if you had an election in 2016, hopefully you have an Excel spreadsheet listing all of the names, addresses, and phone numbers of people who were supportive in 2016. Now, that doesn't mean they're automatically going to be supportive of what you're doing now, but everything else being equal, they're more likely to be supportive. People who always vote. I mentioned that we use the L2 database, and we look at the last 9 elections conducted within the boundaries of a municipality or a school district, and we see how many times did people vote. Well, when we do that and we find people who have voted, let's say 7, 8, or 9 times out of 9, they are going to vote, whether you want them to or not. And so by identifying those folks who always vote, then you need to make sure that the campaign makes contact with them at their door, on the phone, or in some other manner. You should at least have a shot at trying to get a yes vote out of them, since you know they're going to cast a ballot anyway. Supporters with weak turnout history, that would be going back to the early chart where you're looking at what percentage of 18 to 44-year-olds voted in a particular school district referendum. So that's the group that's very supportive of what you have put on the ballot, but they're also very weak in terms of getting to the polls. So we want to identify them so that we can execute some extraordinary GOTV efforts to improve their turnout and get more of them to cast a ballot. All of this leads to the development of a target structure, and this particular district had set a goal of getting 3,300 yes votes. And as you move from the top of this chart to the bottom and over in the left column, you don't have to fully understand all of the abbreviations, but I'll just highlight the first one for you. Target A is what was identified as the best target for this particular district based on two factors. One, they had a high VAN score. Remember I said with that VAN predictive database, the higher the score, the more likely they are to support a progressive proposal. And the scoring in VAN goes from 0 to 100. So the target A people all had VAN scores from 75 to 100. So they had high VAN scores. And the L and the P relate to they're likely to vote based on past voting behavior. So again, looking at the last 9 elections, the L means this group is likely to vote. And the P means that with a little push, we can get them in the door to cast a ballot. So target A was identified as the district's best target. I won't go through all the other ones from top to bottom, but target B is still a good target, but not as good as A. Target C is still a good target, but not as good as A and B. So the strength of the targets is descending from top to bottom, from A to E. In each case, we identify how many voters we have in that target, the number of households, the number of phones, and how many yes votes we realistically think we can get out of that group. And if you added the numbers over in that far right column, you'd be coming up to that 3,300 target that they had set. Now, if you're more into graphics than into numbers and tables, this is what the target structure looks like in a graphic form. And so what we're seeing here is actually 3 dimensions of our target. One would be how likely are they to support your referendum. So you see it at the top, there's a group that says strong support. It also says very active voter. In this context, that would mean that these voters have gotten there at least 6 out of 9 times out of the past 9 elections. And as I said, they also show the strongest support for the referendum. So we're seeing how supportive they are. We're seeing how likely they are to vote based on past voting behavior. And we're seeing the size of that demographic group, starting with the example I used at the top. That's 3% of this particular population. So now we have all the data. We have the voter file targets. We've got our turnout goal. So then what do we do with all that stuff? So the next section of this particular presentation is going to focus on some of the research related to getting out the vote. And we're starting with what's called the predictive voting rational choice theory. It's actually a formula. It's based on research, and it's looking at what's the formula for figuring out how to best get somebody in the door with a yes vote. So let's go through each part of that formula. P signifies power, B, benefit. So we're going to take the power and the benefit, we're going to add that to duty. We want that to basically trump the cost over on the right. So we want everything over on the left side of the formula to be greater, to be stronger than the perceived cost of whatever your proposal might be. So let's go through each of those quickly. The power part of the formula is the perceived power of each vote. How might that sound if you were talking to somebody at the door or sending out something in a flyer? We are expecting a very close election, and your vote is critical.
Both of you seem to have good enough messages for exactly 246 votes. We'll see on Monday who draws the letter Z, and it sounds like there'll probably be a recount as well. But Frank Moe and Kristen Wharton, thank you for your time, and I guess good luck.
That short little audio clip was from NPR, and they were talking about a recent vote in 2018 in Cook County, Minnesota. We had two people running for the Cook County Board of Directors, and they both had received 246 votes. This interview was conducted just before they were going to the tiebreaker, and the tiebreaker was broken with a game of Scrabble to see what letter people would pull out of the bag from A to Z, and that resulted in one of those two individuals going on the Cook County Board of Directors. Well, does that ever happen in real life? I'll show you an example today of how it can. So the benefit. What is the benefit of voting yes? Passage is crucial to the educational future of our kids and our grandkids. The duty, a person's sense of civic duty or gratification. We all have a responsibility as community members to do our part to support our kids. And how do we frame up the cost? The investment in our kids and community will cost only pennies a day. So this formula essentially represents the structure of messaging for Get Out the Vote. It might sound something like this. Finding yes votes, making a strong case that the importance of each vote, the benefit to students, and the civic duty to support kids is greater than the cost. As parents and members of this community, we need to make this happen for our kids. Now is the time to invest in our schools and children. The cost is modest, and our kids don't get a second chance. Every vote is vital to our success, and we thank you for your support. I mentioned that sometimes we have tie votes. One of my colleagues at Springstead was superintendent of schools in Belle Plaine, and in September of 2004, they had a $30 million request for bonding on a referendum ballot. Ended up 868 yes and 868 no. Unfortunately, unlike the race for the county board that I mentioned previously, there was no grabbing numbers out of a Scrabble box to see who won. In Minnesota, a tie vote is a loss. And so they missed out on $30 million and had to come back a year later for a second try. If you want to see some pretty aggressive get out the vote techniques, this is not a referendum, but it's a political party referendum. And in this particular case, everybody in the community got a report card if their past voting behavior wasn't very good, and it listed your name. So Braddock Macy got an F with a turnout percentage of 55% in prior elections. I'm not necessarily recommending this, but it does give you an example of how important GOTV is and the lengths to which some GOTV campaigns will work to try to change turnout, even if it means, in this particular case, shaming people to get out the door. So let's talk a little bit about some of the research related to getting out the vote. A lot of that research is based in Yale, in the Yale Civic Engagement Project. Researchers Donald Green and Alan Gerber have written at least 3 books on getting out the vote. And what they do is randomized control group experiments. So what does that mean? Well, what they'll do is they'll go into a local election, and just before it's time to actually cast the ballot, they'll work with the campaign, and let's say the campaign has identified 5,000 people as their target structure for winning the election. Gerber and Green will take those 5,000 people, they'll randomly put them in two groups, and with one group, they'll get a knock at the door and a flyer. In the other group, they'll get a knock on the door, a flyer, and a phone call. Then after the election is over and they see who voted and who didn't vote, they look back at these two groups, realizing that everybody got the flyer, but only one half of the group got the phone call. Well, did that make any difference in turnout? So that's what a randomized control group experiment is. And they focus on how different interventions mobilize voters and the cost effectiveness of these interventions. This chart gives you a graphic look at the results of their study. And what you're seeing here as you scan across and down is the number of additional votes that you can get with a particular strategy. So upper left, we're looking at door-to-door contacts. And so what that's telling you is if you pound on 14 doors and talk to 14 people, you're going to get one more vote in the ballot box. So then you move over to the middle. You got to make 38 phone calls to get one more vote. With festivals, rallies, and seminars, they say that'll increase your voting 1 or 2%. With a leaflet or a door knocker hung on a doorknob, you need to do 189 of them to get one more vote. So as you look around these, one way to react to it is, gosh, that's a lot of work for only one more vote. And it is. And that's why I said at the beginning that one of the reasons that many GOTV campaigns fall well short of what they need to be is it's hard work. And you have to do a lot of work for some small rewards. You could ask yourself, is it really worth it to pound on 14 doors to get one more vote? Well, let's go back to the Belle Plaine example when they lost $30 million on a tie vote. I think the superintendent would tell you it would have been worth doing that. So let's go through each of these to peel the onion back a little bit. Green and Gerber call the door-to-door canvassing as the gold standard, and they call it the gold standard because it's the best way to get additional votes on election day.
Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump and his running mate Mike Pence are holding a campaign event in Eau Claire, Wisconsin tomorrow evening, the same day that Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Kaine visits Appleton and Madison. Candidate rallies like those are just one way to inspire people to get to the polls and vote. Another technique? A knock on your door. If there's a competitive race for Congress or the legislature where you live, canvassers will probably be on your block in this final full week of campaigning. Candidates, the political parties, and interest groups are in full get-out-the-vote mode. But with early voting already a month old and a tumultuous presidential race affecting voter mood, the exercise has evolved. Reporter Brian Bax has our story.
On a sunny but crisp recent Saturday afternoon, a couple dozen DFL party volunteers gathered in a former bank building for a tutorial. They were about to fan out in the competitive section of the southern Twin City suburbs. Their mission was to work down a carefully honed list of probable Democratic voters, to measure their support for the party ticket, and provide one of multiple nudges those voters will get ahead of Election Day. Party activists Eric Anderson and Ryan Sancardier demonstrated to the rookies how it's done.
Have you thought at all about when you're going to go vote?
I don't know. It's like November, right?
Sure, but a lot of your neighbors are early voting. Yeah, I mean,
Back near the old bank vault, volunteer Norm Draper was making his way through a phone call sheet, getting more voicemail than live answers.
Good. Say, the reason I called is we've identified you as in DFL supporter this November, and we're wondering if we could ask you a few questions.
This is crunch time, and the all-out effort to reach and motivate voters is intensifying as Election Day approaches. The parties, candidates, and their allies have it down to a science.
So this example was from a partisan election, and one of the things that's emphasized by Green and Gerber is that personal and authentic contact does work the best, whether it be on the phone or at the door. And that's just common sense when you think about it. If you get a call from a friend or a coworker or a neighbor, you're going to have a very different reaction than getting a call from a stranger. And even more so when you're talking about a knock at the door. You're going to be much more comfortable with that knock at the door if it's somebody that you already know. I mentioned with Green and Gerber, the controlled experiments. I was indirectly involved in 2 experiments of that type in Wisconsin, and these are school district specific, one in the Stoughton district and one in the Oshkosh. And what they did in that case is they took one group of identified yes voters, and they all got 2 mailings from the campaign committee reminding them to vote. And then the experimental group got the same 2 mailings, but they also got a knock at the door. For those voters who were successfully engaged at the door, the Stoughton turnout was 9% higher, and the Oshkosh was 10% higher. So again, while getting out the vote through door knocking is the most difficult strategy, research clearly indicates that it's also the best strategy. Logistics and training are important. If you're going to send people out into the neighborhoods, they need to know what they're doing. And it is time and labor intensive. And Green and Gerber estimate 6 to 8 households per hour with door-to-door work. And with this door-to-door work, they're talking about engaging people in a conversation at the door as compared to leaving something on a doorknob. Targeted knocks, more effective than blanket. And what that relates to is back to our target structure. We're not going to necessarily knock at every door. We may do our door knocking based on our target structure and leave some doors alone based on what we know about the voters living in that particular household. Using mapping is very, very effective with door-to-door work. And I have a couple of examples of what that might look like. Here what we're doing is taking our voter file target structure and loading it into Guide K-12, which is a geo-visual mapping platform. And we have yellow dots for parents who vote frequently and kind of pink dots for parents who are infrequent voters. Interestingly, in this particular neighborhood, we had 88% infrequent voting and about 11% frequent voting. So this again reinforces a problem with 18 to 44-year-olds and a problem with parents. They don't vote. And to win elections, you have to do a very good job getting those groups in the door. This is also using Guide K-12. Here what we're doing is taking our target structure. So our number 1 target identified was voters with band scores of 50 or higher, and those were mapped in a dark blue. Parents who were frequent voters were mapped in a yellow, and the other targets from top to bottom are mapped as well. Now, if this were live and you were looking at a screen and an internet LCD setup, every dot on that map is live. So you put your cursor on a dot and it's going to tell you who lives in that particular household. And so that creates a possibility to develop maps. And those maps can be used for door-to-door work. This is an example of a suburban school district outside of St. Paul, and the dark boundaries over in the map are not census blocks, they're not zip codes, they are not precincts, they are the walking zones that were developed by the school district specifically for this referendum. So each of those zones had co-chairs who were responsible for getting out the vote in that zone, and they used the Power of Guide K-12 mapping to create walking maps. And again, all of those dots on the map represent voters, and they're all live when you're using this particular tool. Leafleting is the second strategy that Green and Gruber have studied. Leafleting means we're dropping something at the door. It's important that you pay attention to the 4 C's: clear, concise, compelling, and consistent when you do that. And don't take that for granted, and I'll show you an example of why you shouldn't take that for granted in just a moment. Those should include links to more detail. Some people are going to be happy with a few bullets on a leaflet. Others are going to want to peel the onion back and get into things a bit. So you need to give them URL links where they can get more information, links to the school district's website, etc. It's a lot faster than door-to-door because you're not talking to people unless you happen to have a random conversation because the person is at the door when you're dropping your leaflet. Door hangers produce a small but statistically significant benefit. And the reason they do is you hang them on the doorknob, so even if the person isn't particularly interested in what you're dropping, you're pretty assured they're going to have it in their hand once, even if it's only to take it off the doorknob, as compared to being able to, kick a flyer that's on the ground back outside or across onto the porch floor. Include the polling places for larger districts so people know where they vote, and you can also include information about the ballot. Here's an example of a flyer where they've got a little arrow pointing at the ballot over kind of on the left, and they're highlighting to make it easier to read what they're going to see when they actually go into the voting booth. Here's an example of a door hanger. Notice that there's a link where you can get more information, and it's also a place where the campaign worker can write the polling place on that door hanger before hanging it on the doorknob. Phoning is still a very important part of GOTV. Again, as stated earlier on the door-to-door work, it works a lot better if it's an authentic connection. If you get a call from a coworker or a neighbor or a friend asking you for support and asking you to vote, it's going to be more effective than from a stranger. Calls are more effective the closer they are to election day. So most researchers say that 90% of the GOTV pounding on doors and calling should be on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, assuming the election is on a Tuesday. Now, why is that? I like to think of it this way. If I've made an appointment to get my hair cut and I get a call on Monday telling me that Tuesday of next week is my haircut appointment at 10 a.m., that's almost worthless, because I've got 8 days between that reminder call and when I'm supposed to get my haircut, as compared to getting a call at 9 a.m. on the day I'm supposed to get my haircut to remind me. So the closer to the election, the better. Trained volunteers are very important so that those calls are done consistently. And also, research would suggest that having your own volunteers doing the GOTV calls is usually more effective than a professional call center. Although, if you're in a situation where the district, for whatever reason, can't generate the number of volunteers it needs to do this well, then by all means hire someone else to do it as compared to leaving it undone. During the canvassing process, when you're talking to people, when you're knocking on doors before the election, if you can get cell phone numbers, that allows for instant text messaging to remind you to vote. And there's plenty of research now that suggests that using a text for that purpose is more effective than using an email. And if you doubt that's true, just think about your own use and how you react to getting a text during the day. It usually means there's a noise or a buzz or something, and unless we're in a meeting, we tend to grab our phone and see what's going on, and so that's why that's more effective. Robocalls can be a good tool to remind folks, but as I said at the beginning, check with your lawyer with the unique requirements for your state. And logistics and training are important so we can keep track of who we called and who answered the phone and who didn't and who needs another call. So those master databases and coordination are important. In terms of direct mail, refine the list so that only one piece goes to a household. If you're asking voters to raise their taxes because you don't have enough money, if they get 4 mailing pieces that are identical on the same day to the same household because they've got multiple people under the roof who are registered voters, that doesn't exactly build your case that you need money. So it's important to do that work. This also is an opportunity to differentiate message to a target audience. For example, all school districts would have a target audience of parents of children where the oldest child is 4 and hasn't started kindergarten yet. Well, you might have one message that goes to everybody in the community, but you also might have a specific message that goes to that target audience saying, how is this going to affect your children as they move into the K-12 system with the referendum? Mailings also have a secondary benefit of influencing other folks who are in the household. So if you mail a flyer to my house, and assuming it doesn't go in the garbage immediately, my spouse or my adult children or my parents have a chance to look to see what I received as well, and they might scan it and get some benefit out of it too. Direct mail is a good alternative for campaigns who don't have the human resources to go door to door, although I would argue that all school districts have the resources to go door to door, as long as the door to door work is based on your target structure and you're only going to high priority doors and not to all doors. The 4 C's I mentioned before: clear, concise, compelling, and consistent. Why can't we take that for granted that that's going to happen? Well, here's an example of something a school district sent out to its voters to ask them to support. Oh, I guess I'm not quite there yet. There I am. So here's the message that went out. I can assure you that the commitment to excellence will, by its very nature, promote continued transitions into the immediate future. Well, I don't know about your community or your reaction, but this would not necessarily build support for a tax increase in my community based on what the district is saying its needs are in this statement. I skipped a slide. I'm going to go back here. Here's an example of a mailing to a school district. The 4 key things that they want to do on the middle left, the URL for more information on the bottom left. At the top, they're emphasizing the importance of every vote, getting back to what we started with. And again, customized with polling places on the upper right. Email and texting, the more personal subject lines are less likely to be stopped as spam. Short bulleted points with links to more detail. Impact of email on GOTV is more effective if authentic. Now, this is at least the third time, if not the fourth, you've heard that. So if I check my email after I'm done with this webinar recording and scan down and see I have an email from a friend of mine or a colleague, I'm more likely to open it, and I'm more likely to open it first. So when you can organize well enough to have email be personal, it's much better. Graphics and HTML compatible email can provide a more compelling visual message, and viral email can supplement other GOT interventions. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. In terms of click-through rates, typically email is somewhere in the 26 to 62% range. So what we're meaning there is for every email I send out, that's the percentage that actually gets opened. That doesn't guarantee it gets read, but you can improve the click-through rates substantially with a better subject line. In most of our daily lives and in our work, the subject line, in an email, we take a nanosecond to think what that subject is going to be. And so working GOTV, it's suggesting you really think strategically about what the subject line is and what subject line could result in people being more likely to open the message and actually read it. Text messaging, as I mentioned, has almost 100% open rate, and much, much better than email. Some spammy words to avoid, some special characters to avoid. And so I hope as I've gone through this, if nothing else, I've reinforced the fact that when email is part of your get out the vote work, it needs to be planned, it needs to be thoughtful, and you don't want to have 20 people doing their own thing. You want a coordinated, consistent message and approach. These are examples of possible subject lines happening now. Well, if you get that, maybe you would see it and say, what's happening now? You'd be likely to open it. Social media is still relatively new, but certainly a big part of most campaigns now, particularly Facebook. The fourth time now you've heard the word authentic. So the whole friend-to-friend concept with social media, whether that be Facebook or Instagram or another approach, is most effective. We want to see what our friends have done. We want to see what if our friends have voted yet. Festivals, rallies, and seminars. I said earlier that you can increase your turnout 1 to 2% with those kinds of events. Sometimes you get some media coverage, which will boost the turnout even more. You certainly need to include information on how and where to vote, especially with young people. And check your statutes and be cautious with quid pro quo. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. YouTube and viral virtual email can substitute for a live rally. And again, if we can collect the cell phone numbers, we can use it for get out the vote. So here's a couple examples of rallies in your campaign. So these folks were invited to a picnic, and when they got to the picnic, if they had their I voted sticker on, they got to join the picnic and enjoy a chocolate sundae or whatever. The quid pro quo thing comes in. Again, this is getting back to checking with legal counsel. In most states, you cannot buy a vote. And so if people coming to your rally are coming and getting a free sundae, if they have a vote sticker on, you need to check to see if that constitutes buying a vote. Or, believe it or not, it could be free underwear.
That's why we're on this tour, to convince the non-voters and the slackers to come out and vote. Who amongst you didn't vote in the 2000 election? Can I see your hands if you did not vote? Don't be afraid. Nothing's going to happen to you. If you did not vote, stand up, please. Stand up. Stand up over there. Stand up over here. Anybody? You did not vote in the 2000 election, 22 or over. I'd like you to pledge in front of all these thousands of people tonight. And if you will do this, my slacker friends, I will give you a full day's supply of the sustenance of slackers everywhere. Ramen noodles. More for you slacker guys. A clean change of underwear. Will you pledge to vote this year? Will you vote? 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 Let's hear it for the non-voters who are going to vote. And let's get their noodles and their underwear.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Independent from your politics, those kinds of get out the vote rallies occurred all over the country in dozens of university settings, and the turnout from younger voters increased substantially as a result of those rallies. If the rallies were held today, at some point in time, they would be asked to hold their cell phones up in the air and click a particular button, and the campaign would capture their cell phones automatically so that they could be used later for reminders. So organizing the campaign, the key things to remember here is if it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. It can't be something in your head, and it can't be something you just kind of wing it. It needs to be planful. Budget for the cost of your interventions. Are you going to do your calling with volunteers, or are you going to pay someone to call? Recruit and train your volunteers. Make sure that everything you do is within the constraints of the law. Use your target structure for your calling and for your getting out the vote door knocks. Use multiple strategies. Differentiate your strategies based on past voting history. That means that if you've identified me as a yes voter and I voted in 8 out of the last 9 elections, I don't need 6 or 7 strategies as compared to someone who's only voted once. And implement early voting. In many states now, you can do early voting, and you can also use that early voting to do a better job of getting young voters out. I'll give you one quick example. In a Minnesota school district, they lost a bond referendum in 2016, and they had 122 early votes. 1 year later, in 2017, they won, and they had 759 early votes. 200% increase compared to 1 year to the next. So early voting can be very, very effective in that regard. What's your budget, and how much money do you need to raise? How many volunteers do you need to do the door knocking? Are there other organizations that can help? Maybe the DFL party is running a candidate on the same election date as yours, and they'd be willing to drop off some of your literature. What other campaigns are out there, and what are they doing? How many phones do we have? Are we going to buy phones, rent phones? How many cars do we need to give people rides to the polls on election day? And where are we going to have kind of the command control in terms of organizing and supervising? I mentioned the importance of differentiating get out the vote strategies based on how often people have voted in the past, and that's what this chart is emphasizing. So here we're talking at the top, for someone who's voted in 5 out of the last 5 elections, and you've identified them as a yes voter, they might just need a phone call reminder. But if you drop down to the bottom of this chart, for a supporter who has voted in 0 out of the last 5 or 1 out of the last 5, they need to get a phone call, 2 emails, a text message, a Facebook video, a leaflet, a postcard, a door-to-door knock, and a ride to the polls. And this is based on Gerber and Green's research. They need at least 9 interventions to get them in the door. This is an example of what I talked about with a viral email in combination with social media. In this particular district, they were going for a $100 million high school. they designed this logo, and then they sent it out to all their identified yes voters and all their parents and said, take this logo and put it on your social media site, like your Facebook, take your photograph off and replace it with the logo. And by doing that, everybody that they were friends with would suddenly see there was a change on your platform, and they would go there and see that you voted yes for a brighter future. So they had thousands of these circulating in social media. In terms of summary recommendations, develop a detailed plan, strategies, calendar, resources. Set your target number of yes votes to win based on the expected turnout in your election using that 130% margin. Develop a target structure. So target A is your best group of voters, both in terms of likelihood to vote and likelihood to vote yes. Develop your target structure and use mapping to enhance your door-to-door work and your communications. Reinforce and seek to expand your national base. In most school districts, parents only represent 20% of all registered voters. You can't just work with parents. You need to expand beyond parents. Shoe leather politics still works the best. Shoe leather politics is a knock on the door or a personal phone call from an authentic volunteer. Authentic contacts work best for both the door-to-door and phone engagement. Engage young voters in the campaign. Make sure they're at the table. You can use AgeMate, some technology to engage with them, social media, text messaging. And festivals and rallies can be used to fire up the base. They're fun, they get people excited, and they produce 1% to 2% more turnout. Analyze voter data and differentiate for the number and type of interventions. If I always vote and I'm a yes voter, I only need one intervention. If I'm a slacker, I need some free underwear or 9 interventions. And like a sprinter, the GOTV effort needs to run through the finish line, not to the finish line, but through the finish line. And to fire you up with a little fun and to say goodbye on this 4th GOTV webinar series, enjoy this.
Open Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자, 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자, 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자, 그런 반전 있는 여자. 선호해, 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 저 선호해, 커피 씹기도 전에 원샷 때리는 선호해, 밤이 오면 심장이 퍼져버리는 선호해, 그런 선호해. Gangnam Style.
More of that on YouTube if you'd like to see the rest. Good luck with your planning, and feel free to get back to Julie or me if you have questions about this particular webinar or the 3 that preceded it. Good luck with your planning.
Thank you, Don, for that phenomenal advice and recommendations on this very important topic for funding schools with referendums. And thank you for listening to our 4th in the series. And if you have any questions, the information is on the screen. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.